Hello, everybody, and welcome to this somewhat hot afternoon in the UK. I think we're finally at our long-promised heat wave, but it definitely feels like an evening for being on the beach or in a park somewhere. So thank you, everybody, for coming out. Those of you who have to join this discussion, which I think is going to be absolutely fascinating. It's the first in a series of events, which are a collaboration between the Common Futures Conversations project at Chatham House and the Future Leaders Network, and their various networks of young people who are engaging with a number of multilateral summits throughout this year and really working to bring young people's perspectives to these summits, which so often, as we know, are dominated by the concerns of older people, older generations, maybe, if I dare say that. Apologies, any of you who may be joining us who are not young people. We take a very liberal definition of that here at Chatham House, as in keeping with the UN and various other stakeholders. But yeah, so my name's Ben Horton. I work in the Director's Office at Chatham House, and I'm also the project lead of Common Futures Conversations. And I'm really, really pleased to be chairing this session today. I'm going to try and talk for as little time as I possibly can, because we have some wonderful speakers lined up for you. We are focusing today on the G7 summit, which will be happening later this month in Germany. And this is really a launch of a communique that's been developed by the Y7 network, the Youth 7, which is a network of young people from the engaged countries, the 7 countries, which have come together. They've come together for a series of events and dialogues to try and build a kind of manifesto of young people's priorities that will be presented at the summit later this month. And we have some of our UK delegates to the Y7 with us today to tell you a bit more about that and to share the different policy tracks that they've been working on and the specific interventions that they want to call for. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the content. This event is on the record. We're not using the Chatham House rule today for this conversation. We will be recording it. There will be a video afterwards, which will be available publicly and which we'd love for you to share with your friends or your colleagues, anybody who you think would find this interesting. We will be having plenty of Q&A. There will be lots of time for that in this event. And if you want to pitch a question, please do just write it in the Q&A box, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen. So just before we sort of kick off then, I'll introduce you to our speakers. And I'm really delighted to have 3 of the delegates from the Y7 process today, alongside one of my great colleagues at Chatham House, Bernice Lee. So joining me, we have Safia Sangster, the UK head delegate for the Y7 this year, and also a long-standing member of Common Futures Conversations. Safia is a policy advisor at the Ministry of Justice, working on reducing reoffending. And previous to that, she has experience in the voluntary sector, working on mental health, anti-domestic abuse campaigns, and international development. Joining us, we also have Annabelle Rice, who is the Sustainable and Green Planet delegate from the UK for the Y7 network. Annie works for C40 Cities, where she is a manager working on climate budgeting, working with 12 pilot cities to implement new approaches to climate budgeting. She's also a youth climate policy advisor at Care About Climate, an international youth empowerment NGO with whom she attended COP26 in Glasgow last year. Then we also have, alongside them, Michael Yip, who is the UK delegate for Economic Transformation for Shared Progress, which is an awesome title, and I'd love to hear more about that. And Michael is also a research associate at the University of Oxford's China Law and Development Programme. He also heads the Young China Watchers community in London and previously was a UK civil servant. And then finally, last but not least, of course, is my esteemed colleague, Bernice Lee, who is the Research Director for Futures at Chatham House and the Hoffman Distinguished Fellow for Sustainability. She's also the chair of Chatham House's Sustainability Accelerator Advisory Board. Bernice has previously held an amazing list of roles at some leading organizations, international organizations in multilateral settings. She has a lot of experience working with organizations like the G7 and the WTO and a number of other multilateral summits, and she will be providing a bit of feedback from her kind of practitioner's perspective on the proposals that Annie, Safia, and Michael will be pitching today. That's plenty from me. I'm going to shut up now. And first off, we're going to turn to Bernice, who's going to give us a bit of an overview, if you don't mind, Bernice, on sort of the lie of the land, the context for the G7. We're 2 weeks out now. Obviously, it's a month where there are many summits. We've got NATO, we've got the Commonwealth, we've got a number of different sort of preparatory gatherings for COP27 and other summits. But the G7 is a really critical one in the calendar. And could you maybe just start by giving us an overview of where things stand and what the salient issues will be at this summit?
Well, thank you very much, Ben. And also thank you very much for making me feel very old and very underqualified at the same time. But obviously I'm quite aware that while I may not be young anymore, but you're never too old to be a cheerleader for a better future. And so that is really the spirit that I'm bringing to this conversation. I'm honored to be here. And I'm looking forward to learning a lot from all of you as well. Since I came to environmental politics really via the lens of international politics originally back, obviously a million years ago by the look of it, it cannot be said enough that we are now caught in a relatively, frankly, boring circular episode of geopolitics striking back. And that being the case, this means that it is very difficult not to think through how so much has been said at the moment about how the concept of the West, epitomized very much by what are the G7 countries, for example, has been almost ennobled by the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, which is also becoming obviously a very agenda-dominating issue, rightly so, as well as the concept that ultimately it's a projection of the inevitable clash in a multipolar world with, or more multipolar world with large countries like China, which may have been emerging for a long time, which may quote unquote complete its emergence, has in some sense helped brought a sense of unity among many G7 countries. I'm going to say that this morning, under the, on the record, we had an internal discussion among ourselves. Actually, among some of the research teams at Chatham House, around the concept of whether or not it really has brought a more unified West. And I think the honest answer is the jury is probably still out. There's no question that a lot of the othering is happening to help create the sense of unity. But rhetoric aside, commitments and targets and lots of promises aside, the reality is that there's a sense that at the back of the pandemic, of the debt crisis in developing countries, obviously, many of you will know as much, if not better than I do, about the challenge of the climate crisis, as well as obviously right now the Russian invasion and the impending food and energy, not just price crisis, but an actual hunger-related crisis. This means that it is no longer good enough to be an economic bloc with 40% of the world's GDP, claiming that you have moral power. You have to be a moral bloc, but you have to demonstrate how the power of your economy, as well as the power of your morality, have to come together in such a way that really genuinely bring different sense of solidarity and delivery, not just for your own people, which of course is important, but also for the rest of the world as well. So this is in this context that there are lots of expectations, and much of which will be played out in the coming weeks and months in terms of whether or not, if indeed following on from the 2008 to 2011 food crisis, around 20 billion was mobilized at the time to help tackle the crisis, whether or not we will mobilize the same kind of amount for the impending challenges that is already happening right and unfolding is one of the big challenges. Second part is that even though much of it has been discussed around the importance of mobilizing climate finance in terms of obviously not just reducing emissions, but also adaptation, but also in terms of what is called the loss and damage, which is really a form of compensatory payments. Again, we've talked a lot, we've made a lot of promises, we will have processes to deliver those or supposedly delivering those. But at the same time, all eyes right now would have to be on how best it is to make sure that any proposals that are on the table can really deliver in real terms for people on the ground, so that it's not just a set large number that hopefully will be infiltrated throughout, but have mechanisms, vehicles, intermediate targets, etc., in such a way that will actually lead to genuine improvement on the ground, so that it is not just a question of talk, but a question of delivery. So I thought I would end by saying that I sort of did one of my, well, quite often, I mean, by the way, it's a good habit that I think everyone should learn, which is that however much you think you know or doesn't know something, do ask your friends who are smarter than you. So I always do this like WhatsApp poll when I prepare for some of these meetings. So I sort of thought that today might be fun to ask my learned and amazing friends in my WhatsApp, asking them, how would you assess the G7 performance so far this year? And I will tell you that the most generous word that came back was distracted. All the other words were, frankly, quite underwhelming is the word most used, absent. And frankly, I am looking forward to hearing more from your ideas and your proposals in such a way that could help us revive what seemed to be a relatively lackluster situation right now, which is that we have to break through this. If my WhatsApp poll is to be any criteria of judgment, I would say that, let's say, folks like me, i.e. policy wonks, are pretty disappointed so far in the performance to date in terms of delivery. Maybe one last thing I wanted to say is that I also sort of did my own private Google review of coverage of G7 this year compared to last year among sort of global media, especially those based in the UK. And of course, I was struck by how much more there was last year because it was held here compared to this year. Not surprising, of course, that all politics ultimately is local or have been local or will always be. But at the same time, I think it's important for us to remind ourselves, since we would have hopefully an international group of folks with us today, that we will think through obviously more in terms of how that feels on the other side when you are either being othered or want to be more included. And how do we make sure that this agenda doesn't just feel like an elite play game happening in a castle in this time, Schloss Elma, I believe, in Bavaria, which is going to be beautiful and stunning and magical. But at the same time, we need that magic to be turned into something that is actually useful for the bulk of the world. Thanks.
Bernice, thank you so much for those reflections and for setting out all of those important points. I think in particular, the stuff about how we move to delivery, like that is absolutely sort of fundamental. And she's not left you with a small task, Y7 colleagues. So Safia, I'm going to turn to you now, and you're going to answer Bernice's call to action. You're going to tell us exactly how you intend to reinvigorate this somewhat distracted and absent organisation, as Bernice's friends described. Over to you.
Thanks, Ben. And yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, to have a go exactly at tackling this challenge. And Bernice, a huge thank you to you for joining us today. And yeah, talking us through and engaging in discussion on the G7 and the U7 process. I mean, even from what you've outlined in your introduction, I have so many questions for you. But just to introduce myself briefly, like Ben said, I have been a member of the Chatham House Youth Dialogue Programme for a little over 2 years now, but also since January have been the head delegate for the UK delegation to the Youth7. So since January, I have been working on a really important but challenging process as an engagement group to the G7, to have our views heard and have the views of UK youth and the rest of the G7 countries' views represented and consolidated in these really, like Bernice said, can be very extremely elite policy making areas. This year we've been really lucky to be joined by 4 guest delegations. So Indonesia, South Africa, Senegal and Ukrainian delegates joined us as part of the consultation process, but also joined us in Germany for our summit in Berlin, where we spent a week negotiating and drafting what I hope and really believe is a robust set of recommendations, which we're going to go into a lot more detail on shortly, but also just to reflect that that was a really important process for us as well, getting the opportunity to engage in a bit of high-level discussion with some senior politicians, including the German Chancellor himself. And there is a lot of challenges as we face as young people, having our views taken seriously, and also not being just sidelined to stereotypical views of young people, but you know, we have a lot to say on climate change, we have a lot to say on economics, and creating or deconstructing and recreating those dynamics within policy making is so important, and something that we're really working towards through our communiqué. So I guess just to preface this discussion that we're going to have, and it really kind of draws on what Bernice was saying before, one reflection that I have taken away so far from the process that I've really been kind of struck by is that importance of accountability and the agency of young people to stand up in their communities or to politicians, to policymakers, and hold them to account and say, you know, this, what you're currently delivering isn't good enough, and it's not good enough for us now, it's not good enough for our futures. And I've been so blown away and impressed by that determination from, you know, across the delegations and all the other young people that we've met through this process, who are really pushing for change and who want to make themselves, and are really saying that we deserve to be part of the solution to what are really complex and dynamic challenges, with obviously extreme shifting global context, which Bernice has already outlined a bit for us, but again, we can unpick throughout the course of this discussion. But I guess, I want to give a lot of time for that Q&A, so I'll wrap up there, but really excited to dive into this with you all today.
Yeah, thank you so much for setting all of that out. It sounds like a really sort of in-depth process, and a really meaningful one as well. So it would be great to hear maybe a bit more of your reflections towards the end about, you know, what worked about that, and what you think maybe could be improved in the future, and how we really do that sort of meaningful participation from young people to make sure that youth are not always just kind of the photo opportunity, that there is actually substance that young people are bringing to this. But before we get into that conversation, we're going to hear a bit more now about the Y7 communiqué. And who would like to kick us off? I'm looking at Annabelle, who's going to tell us a bit about the climate aspects of the communiqué, I believe. Take it away.
I am, yes, and it would be great if you could share our slides, Fiona, as well. Perfect, thank you so much. And I just want to thank both Bernice and Safia for those really eloquent comments, and you're not making it a very easy act to follow so far. And also wanted to echo Bernice's comment about inclusion in the G7 and the fact that we had the partner countries. We all came back and said it was just an incredibly valuable experience to have those extra insights. So next slide, please. So as has already been hinted at, whilst our policies are clearly being shaped by the international agendas, including the invasion of Ukraine, COVID-19, and the cost of living crisis, it's really our belief that we can't let acute crises derail our long-term action, particularly on climate change. And in that endeavour, the climate track was split into 3 sub-tracks, which we felt best addressed the crisis from a youth perspective: nature and biodiversity, climate change mitigation, adaptation, and global partnerships for sustainability. So within the first subtrack, the Y7 is calling for an increased recognition of the interdependence of biodiversity and climate crises through holistic policies which tackle the two in tandem. We felt that this could best be addressed by creating ambitious global standards for protected areas, which include local communities both in process and in implementation of these areas. Secondly, we're calling for regenerative agricultural practices to be implemented, including banning harmful chemicals by 2030, supporting seed sovereignty, and restoring agricultural land. Thirdly, we're calling for G7 countries to take the lead on achieving no pollution by 2050, particularly through developing effective wastewater and stormwater management systems. In the second subtract, we want the G7 to close the 1.5 ambition gap by firstly making no further investments in new fossil fuel infrastructure and redirecting funding towards renewable. These efforts should prioritise just transition mechanisms, supporting impacted workers and young people. G7 countries must also accelerate the urban mobility transition, incentivising public transport, walking and cycling. Finally, adaptation must be elevated in urban areas, particularly through the use of nature-based solutions and effective urban planning. In the final subtract, our focus turned to the German presidency's priority of a climate club. And for those who are unfamiliar with the concept, a climate club is one in which countries who move first on climate action would be rewarded and protected from competitive disadvantage. Members would harmonise their plans to reduce emissions and work towards a shared goal. The nations that don't meet these obligations would incur penalties such as a levy on exports to club member nations. And it's our contention this club must include meaningful youth participation in all negotiations and decision-making, including in negotiations on the carbon price floor and on carbon leakage. The 100 billion a year that's been promised in climate finance must be met and rapidly ramped up, and funding needs to be earmarked for biodiversity financing. And finally, we're advocating for a donor economic model to be investigated and deployed, creating an economy that meets our societal needs whilst remaining in planetary boundaries. The Y7 has been an opportunity not only for UK youth, but for global youth to have their voices heard on the international stage. But I want to reiterate that this communiqué is the beginning of the work and not the end of it. We will really be continuously advocating for all G7 countries to implement our recommendations and to lead on climate action. Thank you. I'll leave it there. And I think I'm passing over to Michael.
Thanks very much, Annabelle. Ben, can I just double check that I'm audible?
We can hear you well.
Perfect. I'll be saying a few words on the cluster of economic policy recommendations that we made to the G7 presidency. And I suppose by way of an introductory remark, if I could draw your eye to the text at the bottom of the slide. I think the backdrop for our discussions this year at the Y7 Summit this year is that economic transformations of our time do disproportionately affect young people. And when we look forward to ensure the bright futures for today's and tomorrow's youth, we settled on three crucial things that we wanted to see. First, investment in education and innovation, safeguarding and expanding the frameworks of social protection and regulating markets to serve the common good. And if I could now draw your eye back to the three boxes, which were the three economic policy subtracts that we used to structure our recommendations. The first one is on education and innovation, and the three sort of policies that we settled on and recommended to the presidency included investing 0.5% of GDP per year into education and skills training so that young people can adapt to and succeed in the upcoming digital and environmental jobs transition. We also wanted to see more protection for refugees in light of the Ukraine crisis, but refugees in general in G7 countries, particularly when it comes to connecting them with civil society organizations and job opportunities. And thirdly, under the education and innovation subtract, we also called upon the UK government and G7 countries to provide equitable financing tools. These might include grants, loans, fully funded R&D programs for entrepreneurs, MSMEs, particularly those operating in a rural context or are led by people from marginalized and underrepresented communities. So those were the three policy recommendations under the education and innovation umbrella that we brought to the G7 presidency. In the second subtract on a sustainable and equitable economic order, again, three policy asks. We called upon G7 countries to immediately increase the share of development financing, or ODA, to meet 0.7% of gross national income, with a greater focus on mobilizing domestic resources of the recipient countries. We also wanted to see more regulation of unpaid employment opportunities, and actually to outright ban unpaid internships longer than 1 month. And thirdly and finally, under this sustainable and equitable economy cluster, We also called upon governments to expand social protection systems and provide financial aid access to resources such as energy and food in view of the current cost of living crisis. Thirdly, for the final cluster of policies under the responsible markets and fair fiscal policy umbrella, again, 3 policy asks. The first is we called upon governments to establish global disclosure standards in compliance with those of the International Sustainability Standards Board, so that we can have transparent, measurable and comparable information on ESG by the end of 2022. And this is really important because that enables young people to, well, this informs young people's advocacy actions, but it also enables young people to make informed decisions about what goods and services they buy, for example. The second policy is ask was to call for governments to introduce a fair and differentiated global carbon price that Annie touched upon earlier. And thirdly and finally, calling on G7 countries to commit to collectively contributing at least 50% of the IPCC's 3.8 trillion per year energy finance estimate to advance the 7th Sustainable Development Goal on clean and affordable energy. So those are the policies, and I guess I'll now pass on to Safia.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, so this year I am the delegate for 2 separate but closely linked policy tracks, resilience of democracies and youth, peace and security, which I will go into in a little bit. But I think, yeah, as an introduction to this policy track, it is important to recognise how much the situation in Ukraine has shaped these recommendations, of course, but also that they are underpinned by a real recognition and a real drive of all the delegates to acknowledge and address issues of threats to peaceful democratic societies across the globe, with an understanding that, you know, every context and country has their own challenges domestically as well as internationally. But to go into our recommendations. So the first subtrack focuses on education for the digital era, obviously something that the COVID-19 pandemic has spotlighted over the last couple of years, but also the general rise in technology has reshaped some of the current demands of young people related to education. So the recommendations are to eliminate technological barriers and reduce the digital divide by promoting lifelong learning in digital literacy and financing access to digital devices for young people. The second is to provide additional resources for educators in both formal and non-formal education settings to strengthen critical thinking skills, so that students are supported to navigate the overwhelming consumption of information that is available today. And finally, to increase incentivising of project-based and collaborative learning opportunities for young people, with a focus on internships and civic volunteering. Our second policy focus was safeguarding and strengthening open societies, which is really a push for mechanisms that are combating some of those emerging threats to democratic institutions, but also increasing transparency of social media platforms and protecting civil society's ability to engage in advocacy, especially for marginalised groups. So we proposed a call for G7 countries to establish a unified, transparent definition of disinformation, human rights abuse, privacy, online safety and violent extremism, really to streamline a unitary enforcement approach to these issues. The second is to implement anti-corruption and accountability mechanisms, such as public political lobby registers, legislation watchdogs, and improving freedom of information rights to increase government accountability. And thirdly, the introduction of legislation for large social media platforms to provide access to privacy compliant data for the purpose of research to thesis students and researchers. And then lastly, there was a really strong impetus among the engagement group this year to address a really stark piece of research and general kind of consensus over the last couple of years, that when it comes to faith in democracy, millennials and young people are the most disillusioned generation in living memory. So to democratize active citizenship and reshape democracy, we are urging G7 leaders to facilitate inclusive methods of engaging youth and other marginalized communities who face structural barriers to contributing their perspectives into policymaking discussions. We're also urging the legislation of governments to have duties to respond to feedback, and finally ensuring accountability and measurement of success of the policymaking process through a unified standard on how citizens' views are translated into policymaking and decision making. And on that, I will hand back over to Annie, who's going to cover global health and solidarity for us.
Yeah, apologies. You have to hear from me again, as unfortunately Zane couldn't make it today. So yeah, the global health subtrack has three distinct areas: women's health, food security, and global partnerships. For women's health, the track was working towards a world where women in all their diversity, inclusive of gender identity, are safe. A particular focus is the need to tackle gender-based violence and gender discrimination in healthcare, including in research and treatment, as well as the need for sexual and reproductive health and rights to be guaranteed to create a safer and fairer world for all. Policy recommendations included funding and the provision of comprehensive training for public servants on gender-based violence, increased investments into women-specific health research, and fully subsidised contraception. For food security, the track recommended a number of policies to work towards a world where we are taking adequate measures to combat income inequality exacerbated by climate change and conflict, so that in accordance with SDG 2, no person anywhere in the world suffers from food insecurity. Policies included committing to fully fund the WFP Global Response Plan for a total of $18.9 billion, and commitments to avoid export bans on any food products and supporting the diversification of national food production and trade partners. For global partnerships, the track wanted to address the significant challenges posed by COVID-19 and the mental health crises through investments in innovative solutions, such as digital health, to improve health equity, accessibility, and security for young people everywhere. One particular area of focus was mental health, with us wanting to encourage governments to improve the provision of support services in order to address growing challenges on mental health. With respect to the structural causes of poor mental health, we want there to be an increased emphasis on national standards for mental health education, coupled with national campaigns and training for universities and employers. Overall, a broad range of policies to address the multitude of global health challenges facing the world. We really do want to encourage everyone, though, to read the full communiqué, and I'm sure Zane would be happy to answer any questions you might have over email, something like that, as he couldn't make it today. And I can hand back over to Safia now.
Thank you. Yes. So finally, I will just talk briefly on youth, peace and security, which was added this year as an additional track. Normally there are only 4, but there was a recognition that this is, a pressing issue and a policy space where the role of young people is crucial, and, they should be able to share their views and have them included in this decision-making process, which has really framed this year's G7. So the principal aim of the recommendations is to encourage G7 countries to take concrete actions to institutionalize the youth, peace and security agenda, which is a United Nations approach to including young people in solutions to peace and security issues. And some of our asks are to improve youth participation in formal and informal peace processes, including formal negotiations and humanitarian responses. I think there was a really clear recognition that, while often young people do tend to be excluded from high-level policy making, in particular peace building processes and formal negotiations regarding conflict are one of the most kind of elite areas where views aren't represented firsthand by young people. The second area focuses on ensuring access to basic needs and healthcare of conflict-affected youth, especially services in response to gender-based violence. And I know there is impetus from some G7 kind of governments to draft a convention on violence against women and girls in conflict settings, and we're very supportive of concrete actions that would achieve that goal. And then finally, challenging perceptions of youth as threats via democratized justice, refugee and immigration policies that focus on human security and invest in the meaningful integration of conflict-affected youth. I think just as a final note to that frames the whole youth, peace and security agenda is that there is a real stigma that needs to be broken, that youth are actually the causes of violence and where the solution sits. And it's a completely unfair stereotype. And all of these recommendations really contribute to the need to see young people as part of the solution to these conflicts and contexts of violence. So that is a lot of detail that we have gone into on the recommendations. Like Annabelle said, there's even more, but I want to give plenty of time for the discussion. So we'll make sure to share the link to the communiqué so everyone can read the recommendations in full in their own time.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for your sort of setting that out so clearly. That was really, really interesting. And there's such a range of policy issues that have covered there, and in such sort of detail, which is fantastic. I'm going to turn over to Bernice. I've got some questions that I want to ask, but I'd just like to come to Bernice first, and just sort of building on what you've heard in terms of the process that they've gone through, but then also about the substance that is included in this communiqué. I just wonder if you've got any feedback for our team here.
Yes, delighted, and also feeling sort of very positively spinning, in a good way. It's always good when you feel a bit buzzy after you hear lots of great ideas. But also I think that I want to thank you all for reinforcing the idea that obviously long-term challenges shouldn't stand aside because of the short-term challenges. At the same time, short-term challenges cannot stand aside either for the long-term one. And that actually reinforces the idea that I think is embedded within your excellent proposal, or the communiqué, which is that all these different areas are interconnected, that we don't have the luxury of solving one challenge at a time. So we would have to make sure that to the extent possible, that each of the solutions that you're proposing have to solve multiple challenges at the same time. So I think that that's an excellent undertaking in order to help us connect the pieces and reinforce us as the idea that no luxury of doing one thing at a time, therefore must deliver it all. However, having said this, you will know that as soon as you arrive, they're going to tell you, well, okay, this is all fantastic. How can we disagree with you? But tell me, where are the three areas I should start first? Because of the cost. So why don't you have a go at telling me, where would you start first? I mean, the second thing they would ask you would be, which is why I wanted to sort of throw it back at you, which is, well, fantastic ideas. We all know that we need to do all of this, but yet it's not for the lack of trying that we're trying to mobilize money. Help me convince my electorate that this is good for them as well. How would you help them convince their electorate? Because as I said, all politics are ultimately local. We have to somehow find a way to help them convince their electorates back home as well. So how would you, I mean, I guess in a way, I'm not necessarily looking for, I have very specific comments about especially areas that I know a lot about, which is obviously on the environment side, mainly, and some of the economic transformation side. But I mean, I don't want to go into the detail there, but I just want to sort of help, let's hear you sort of think through how would you go about helping them prioritize and helping them convince their electorates that this is important, so that you're helping them do their retail politics on the other end as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for those questions. I mean, Safia, Michael, Annabelle, do you have any initial reflections on those sort of points? Anybody want to have like a first stab at that?
I'm happy to have a try, but I'd really call upon Safia and Annabelle to plug in any gaps that I leave behind, if that's okay. Bernice, thanks for those comments, and I completely agree with you that the prioritization of these ideas is needed in order to get the attention and traction of the policymakers. And I think that when I look back on the engagement process that we've had with not just German officials, but also UK officials too, I think the team have been really conscious of trying to provide a value add in terms of what we've been putting to them and pitching to them, because there are multiple engagement groups for the G7, climate included. And so I think that when I think about, what value the youth voice can, unique value the youth voice can add. I find my mind being drawn to mental health being the sort of key focal area that was proposed to the G7 last year, and once again is being proposed to, again, German officials and the UK officials too. And so I think that would be the sort of one cluster of policies that the youth find themselves going back to and sort of keeping the politicians accountable on. But the truth is, you're absolutely right. All of these policies ideally should be moved forward at the same time as each other. And to that extent, I suppose this is why we rely on having a large network of different interest groups feeding into the G7, not just on youth and climate, but also on business, think tanks, civil society organizations, and women as well. So that would be my sort of first stab at your response, which I completely agree with, but equally, Annabelle, Safia, and anything else that I might have left behind?
Definitely not that you've left behind, but I do have a few thoughts to add on to it as well. I think in terms of prioritization, it's always really important to know your audience. And with the G7, what do they actually have strong control over? And from a climate perspective, obviously that's my track, so I can speak more to it. We've tried to prioritize our approach to the Climate Club because we know that that's a German priority and that has a real chance of being enacted this year. And we want to make sure that what results from those conversations is something that works for young people. And so I think it's important that you prioritize based on the people that you're talking to as well. So we wouldn't go into the G7 and be asking them to try and get China, as you said earlier, to do something. That's not under their control. We need to make sure that we're really focused in our asks and make sure that it's something the G7 can achieve. And in terms of your second question on convincing the electorate, I think that I've always thought that climate change has a huge communications problem, and it's bad PR around climate change has done a lot of bad in the electorate as well. And I think that it's about changing the narrative. It's about not seeing a lot of these policies as a sacrifice, but as something that actually will benefit us as a whole. I mean, even when we're looking at the urban policies, by 2050, the majority of people that live in cities will be under 18, which is a startling statistic. And it makes you think that we need to be listening to what young people are saying right now, because the choices that we're making in the future that we're building needs to work for the people who are going to be living in it. So yeah, if Safia has any other comments too.
No, I think all very well said. I think the only thing I would add with the electorate, which is something that we definitely struggle with in the UK and in other countries as well, is that our young people don't go out and vote and don't exercise their right as an electorate to push these views that, they're telling us that they believe in. So I think, the recommendations on democratic engagement and policy engagement kind of in consultation is really important, because there is, a problem in education, and there is a problem in supporting young people to understand that this is their right to exercise, and that change, like you said, change is local, and change starts within your community and with the vote that you cast or the policies that you support. In my local area, we've got an amazing charity that it does exactly that and works to get young people out, to the polls, but also, engaging in consultations. And I think having that on a widespread level would create a huge shift in policy priorities for our governments.
That's really good. Bernice, did you want to come back on any of that, of what you heard?
No, I think that sounds great. I also think that there's no one narrative, right? We've got to keep trying, and therefore, I think part of the challenge is exactly how do you keep it alive, because it will always come back in some form or another. even if we may find that today, this particular technology is cheaper, tomorrow it may not be. So in some sense, it is a sense of renewal. I'm writing a book about that at the moment, or I'm trying to at the moment about that. How do you keep that sense of renewal? And then at the same time, I think that mindful of that, and that that's particularly relevant to the concept of climate club, that one of the most important criticism against it so far is indeed the idea that it is done as a unilateral instrument. There is a world of multilateralism that see unilateralism as a flaw in itself, and I sort of feel that the idea, the merits of the idea itself is often brushed aside when it is not seen to be done in an inclusive fashion, including that of the climate club. I just wonder whether or not it would be helpful for the group to be presenting some ideas that could help it to become more inclusive, so that it didn't feel like a unilateral instrument developed solely because of a particular instrument. I mean, the climate club makes or rather border carbon adjustment makes a lot of sense if you had a carbon pricing regime. It may make less sense if you hadn't. So multilateralizing the instrument brings a different type of challenge. And so I just sort of wonder whether or not it would be good. I'm just picking this as an example, just because it's something that I've spent. You don't know me, but if you had known me, you would know that I literally wrote a long article arguing why this is a really bad idea to have a climate club. And it was published on the One Economic Farm website a while ago with Richard Barron at the European Climate Foundation. But I think that I'm not arguing as me from a year ago. I'm suggesting that if, however, we want to make this fly, and we all have an interest in making this fly and not become a combustible problem that could derail other things. So I just want to sort of make sure that when you're engaging on that particular concept, it would be really good if you can help make sure that it is multilateralizable, inclusive, and therefore not presented as a solution that my way or highway kind of solution for the world, which I think oftentimes ideas die because they're easily presented as my way, as highway, and that includes as much of some of the climate solutions as it does for other areas of proposals that we might come up with as well.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that, I think that all I can say is, firstly, I completely agree. And if we'd had a little bit more time, we've got quite a detailed policy proposal, which does include a lot of those ideas, because we had the same thoughts, that we think that a climate club is going to happen, was kind of our starting point. And therefore, how do we make it the best version that it can possibly be? And some of the recommendations that we included revenue recycling, which we felt did actually make a club more inclusive, and also the marginalized communities and youth and those impacted by the climate club would be consulted and involved in both process and implementation. So our whole ethos is that how can we make the climate club the most inclusive that it could possibly be if it's already going to happen under the German presidency?
Yeah, that's oh, sorry, Bernice, were you gonna?
Well, I just want to throw one more thing in that I learned
Sure.
from my good friend a couple of days ago, which I thought was a good idea that I'm going to, and she would have no problem with my sharing this with youth among others, and I can't tell you who she is because I think that means it was Chatham House rule, but nonetheless, I mean, we talked a lot about just transition often, and oftentimes we focus on the supply side, but obviously we need a just transition from the demand side as well. And I think that maybe one of the emphasis, obviously, at the moment is in the idea that, a lot of demand side measures, including energy efficiency, reduction in consumption, has to be part of the solution. And so I sort of felt that maybe you could also add that dimension to it as well, which just transition isn't just about supply. Of course, it is about workers in the production side, but also in the consumption side and the demand side, because it had implications for the technologies that I think Michael and yourself have both talked about, and Safia as well, in terms of both the digital technology as well as the innovation and the education agenda, when you look at the demand side in a more broader sense of the puzzle as well. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bernice. I wanted to try and bring in a couple of the questions from our participants, and please do keep them coming if you've got questions that you'd like to ask, keeping it relatively high level. We actually just had a comment from Winona Nethercott, which I think is worth sort of reading out for everybody, which is that in response to Bernice's question about how can we convince the electorate and how can we use that kind of justification to advocate with policymakers, she answered that she thinks elected officials may want utilize more grassroots engagement with their electorate, and maybe these kind of youth networks are one way in which to do that, for example by utilizing social media and community engagement. But I think she's just emphasizing the point of how important it is that there is at least some sense of a kind of mandate behind these proposals, which I think the Y7 process does feed in with your consultations that you do and those sorts of things, but it just shows that that kind of methodology is really sort of critical. And then another thing that has come up in the chat here from another member of Common Futures Conversations, Kyria Joel Keith, thanks so much for joining us. And Kyria, I mean, actually, sort of unfortunately, your question leads us on to another sort of very important subject really, which is the extent to which the Y7 should be representing young people elsewhere in the world, because Kyria, I'm sure, won't mind me sharing that he's based in Uganda, and he's asked, how can I become a member of the Y7? And obviously we've got the 7 countries that kind of constitute the G7 summit, and obviously like that's your framework to work within. And we've heard a lot about in this conversation already about, you know, politics being local and it needs to be specific to countries and domestic agendas. But at the same time, do any of you maybe want to reflect on the extent to which advocacy groups like the Y7 should be trying to represent global youth, and how do you bring in those considerations, those perspectives from the global south or other parts of the world, which can kind of feed into what you're doing? Or was it very much kind of, this is what's happening in my country, this is what I should be trying to represent? So I just wonder if you've got any reflections off the back of Kyria's great question there.
Yeah, I could start us off. I think it is a really great question, and something that really framed a lot of the discussions that we had to negotiate our policy recommendations, that the kind of exclusivity of the G7 countries doesn't really cut it anymore. You know, already it has evolved a lot from kind of the fireside chats of kind of our kind of esteemed politicians, but it still has a really long way to go to really incorporate a more holistic global view. And I think, you know, we made some progress there with the partner delegations that were invited this year, but you know, there's huge practical challenges to overcome first, you know, things like having translators. And I think really, if we're going to make an effort and we're going to really commit to having kind of inclusive policy making and international decision making that isn't so elite, we need to be really challenging ourselves, and the G7 countries need to be challenging themselves a lot more than they are currently. I know that, you know, we did make an effort to consult views wider than UK youth, so I reached out to the Common Future Conversations platforms and got some really amazing feedback from our members across Africa, in countries outside of the European Union. The EU do have a delegation as well, we should have mentioned, so views are represented there as well. But it feels like there is a long way to go, and there is starting to be a recognition of that.
I wonder if I could jump in with a brief footnote to add to what Safia said, in which I'm in agreement. I think ultimately when we think about inclusion and representation, that there's a trade-off actually that's attached to your question, Ben, or to Kyria's question, because on one hand, you know, I like to think that myself, Safia, and Annabelle and I are aware of issues that pertain to people living outside of the UK, but equally, and therefore, given that Kyria isn't in the room with us, we might want to speak out on those issues. But that exists as part of a trade-off where actually, on the other end of the spectrum, there's an acknowledgement that I'm not actually best placed to speak authoritatively on some of the issues that Kyria would want to bring to the table, and others too. So I think the only way that you can bust that trade-off is actually to increase the representation that you see at places like the G7. I don't think it would cut it for myself to, to do a bit of desk research or have some conversations and take those views to the table on the behalf of others. So that would be my footnote that I'd like to add. That there's a bit of a trade-off, but we bust it by actually increasing the consultation and the representation.
If I could just follow up on that as well, sorry. I was just going to say, it kind of goes back to the idea of whether or not you think that the G7 is still a useful tool. It's in itself, in that should the G7 be talking about all of these really global issues. And I know even going into the G7 process, there's this kind of idea that what is discussed at the G7 then shapes the agenda kind of for the rest of the year. So even going into the G20 or NATO or whatever it is, there's a lot of the discussions that actually happen at the G7 in this exclusive club. And as Safia said, there were practical challenges with having the partner countries, as amazing as it was. And for example, they didn't join the process until slightly later on because they were still being recruited once we'd already started the process. And so there's still a lot of hurdles to be worked out in terms of inclusion. But yeah, just to echo again that I think that that's an incredibly important question. But just as the second part of your question, where you were talking about, when we got there, were we all representing UK? Was it US? Was it? But it didn't necessarily feel that way. I think because none of us are government representatives, there was this sense that we were all building towards these bigger issues. So whichever track you were on, it was like climate change was the issue, and there were lots of like collaborative efforts of how do we all think that this could best be solved, rather than what does the UK want, what does the US want, because we're not government representatives, we're there to represent youth. So yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. Yeah, we've got a couple of maybe slightly more specific questions, and I just want to whiz through them before we get on to the next part of this event. So Safia, we've got a question for you from Michael May about this issue of mental health, and he'd like to know, how do you perceive the mental health of UK youth citizens? Where do you think we're headed on mental health? Obviously, in these contexts of these global and local crises, COVID, war in Ukraine, cost of living crisis, is this something that you think is going to become a more salient issue on the political agenda? I mean, obviously, it being part of the Y7's advocacy, presumably you think it is something that needs more airtime, but could you maybe speak a bit more to that?
Yeah, definitely. And it's a great question, because in the last 2 years, it's really sharpened in focus, as a focus point for the Y7 agenda. And I definitely think, we're already suffering from huge impacts on young people's mental health as a result of COVID and changing political situations, and a real resource issue or kind of support services issue in the UK in particular. And I think, it's, again, we talk a lot, especially when we're thinking about the G7 and spanning across so many issues. Mental health is a cross-cutting agenda, and there's not one of these policy issues that we've talked about where mental health isn't severely impacted by the outcomes or failures that are achieved through the policy decisions that are made. And one reflection I guess I would just end on is that it is encouraging to see a shift. I mean, I think, perhaps as young people, we feel like there is a lack of agency, but, even the progress that we have managed to make over the last 2 years on getting this on the agenda, and, talking to our leaders and saying, we want you to push harder on this, push for further support, increased services, is a real testament to young people's agency and the changes that we are having, and that we need to keep that momentum going, because it definitely does still feel like a pressing issue.
I wonder if I could just add a quick point to what Safia said on how mental health is cross-cutting in a way that goes back to Winona's question, because I realized that we didn't quite address that. When we think about convincing the electorate, although I think we need to be realistic about our power and ability to do that, because the electorate comprises lots of different demographics and interests. What matters to me, what matters to youth in general, will not reach across and touch everybody across the whole of the UK participating in elections. But mental health is one of those, maybe not rare topics, but one of those special topics maybe that has been seen to, or indeed has been proven to have this near universal kind of importance for everybody across the UK, that I think means that when the youth think about, okay, how can we maximize our voice and maximize our reach in terms of shaping policy, it's policy areas like mental health that mean that actually, okay, if we advocate on them, that means that may mean that we have an increased likelihood in bringing together the broadest possible coalition of people, because the truth is mental health affects young and old, rich and poor, and so on and so on. And so that would just be one sort of observation I'd make about the mental health policy area that hopefully goes to your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm conscious of time, and I want to get on to the advocacy sort of call to action that you guys have got for the end of this event. But before we do that, I just wanted to be really, really unfair and obviously return to Bernice's question about prioritization, which she brought up at the start of this. And I think the mental health example that you've been discussing just there, and obviously the success that the Y7 had last year with sort of getting it on the agenda of the main summit, really, really important work. I just would be really curious to know, out of your incredibly impressive and extensive communique, I'd like each of the three of you to pick the one thing that you want to be the next mental health. What's mental health 2.0 like? What issue there are you particularly passionate about getting that right? And while you're thinking about that, I wonder, Bernice, if I could just come back to you, and just from a really practical sort of perspective, could you just give us a sort of bit of closing advice for our colleagues here? You know, they're jetting off to Bavaria to the lovely mountains very soon, where hopefully it will be a bit cooler than it is in London today. What would be your advice in terms of approaching the negotiations that are going to start up there?
Thank you. I think I gave you the kind of questions that I would prepare myself, right? And the reason for that is because ultimately, you know that everybody wants you to help them do their job better. You know, assume everyone has the goodwill to want to deliver something good for the world. So therefore, whatever you can give them in bite size or whatnot that actually really help them do the job. I wouldn't worry about not being comprehensive, Michael, in terms of whether or not I appeal to all of the electorates. I would say that, to be specific about, you can help them with this particular segment of the electorates that they may get. That would be a good starting point. And the second thing I would say is that it strikes me that, you know, if indeed we approach all of these questions with the kind of open-heartedness and open-mindedness that you guys are approaching it, which is to entertain the possibility that it is possible to deliver all multiple goals at the same time. Because remember, oftentimes we stop ourselves before we start. So therefore, appealing to the sense of possibility is always a challenge, but nonetheless important, because otherwise we will always be self-censoring before we have a chance to deliver the next step. So I think that keeping that spirit, which you obviously all have aplenty, which is to bring the possibility, but also the ability to deliver multiple goals at the same time, because you know what, you have something that I don't have, which is the kind of time frame that you have to work towards. And so being able to be inspiring enough to help them figure out how is it that they could appeal to the future generation. And again, I mean, if I wouldn't worry about not being able to do it all. I would be much more specific about what you can deliver. And that way you help them, you know, remember, whoever you're talking to, a politician, a civil servant on the other end, some of you are even civil servants yourself. So you know there's someone who can give you that paragraph that could stop you from having to cut and paste tomorrow. It's already a great help, if nothing else. So I would start with that. I mean, these are the kind of questions I ask myself. You know, the so what question. Why do I have to do it tomorrow? How would that help the person I'm talking to? And why should the person on the other side listen to what I said? If he asked me or she asked me, so what? What is my answer to the question?
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Bernice. Right, so who am I going to put on the spot first? I guess I'm going to come to Annabelle for no reason.
No problem. Yeah, I think firstly I'm feeling very inspired by what Bernice has said, and thank you for your really useful comments. Actually, I think it's something for all of us to think about. The one for me, I think if we're pulling out something like mental health, we're pulling out a principle of our communiqué and what we'd like to be taken forward. And for me, it's biodiversity. And I think that young people are really good at not compartmentalizing. They have been able to break down these silos and see policies holistically as they should be. And for me, biodiversity has consistently been left off the G7 agenda. It's been neglected. The importance of biodiversity hasn't been recognized. I think the research this week came out that said that there's 20 years left of viable soil in the UK, and things like that are something that are definitely going to be impacting young people and generations to come. And that's the thing for me, that young people have been so good at seeing the link. Biodiversity has been so incredibly crucial when even in the COVID pandemic, how we've all had people that have had access to nature and green space and things like that have been so benefited from it. So yeah, I would like to see biodiversity more firmly on the G7 agenda.
Lovely. Safia.
Thank you. I think I would go for mental health education from, primary school age. My vision would be to see a world where mental health is treated as seriously as physical health, and we know just as much about it, and we feel just as comfortable to talk about it in the classroom with our families. And obviously alongside education has to come the support services and those services in the community. But that would be my one ask for G7 countries.
Perfect. And Michael?
Thanks, Ben. When I think about mental health meets economy, I think about how in lots of workplaces and in lots of educational institutions, you already have things like mental health first aiders that provide that sort of first line of assistance to people who are in need of help in that regard. But I think there's more that we can do, particularly when we think about how right now, certainly in the UK and also in other G7 countries too, that are integrating refugees and temporary protection seekers from Ukraine and other countries into workplaces domestically. I think there's a space there for us to think about how we can provide resources or training that's a bit more targeted to the contexts that refugees and temporary protection seekers are coming from, particularly in a way that means that when there's a mental health issue arising in the workplace, that mental health first aider can step in really in a much more tailored and appropriate way than we had before. And so the focus on sort of refugee experiences, people seeking temporary protection being embedded into mental health first aid in both work and education would be my call.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much for those, and hope we can get you back to report on how it went. And yeah, this is very much just going to be the first conversation in this series. Oh, Bernice would like to come back.
Yeah, one thing that I forgot, I kept writing it down in front of me, I kept forgetting to mention it. Jeopardy. I was going to say that, look, I mean, I have obviously suggested that you should be as rational and as open-minded and happy and open-hearted as possible. But at the same time, you also you need to help create a sense of jeopardy. Meaning, what if it doesn't get done in the way that you said it would? So I would also prepare yourself for a few quick lines on the sense of jeopardy that is politically meaningful for your interlocutors as well. That's all.
Super important point. Thank you for bringing that up. Well, before we close, there's just one more thing that we wanted to get across, which is actually how the audience who are here can get involved in the advocacy that's about to be coming up in the next couple of months, and months and years maybe, if these policy issues really get some air. So Safia, are you going to tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, I can just quickly let people know how they can get involved with the Future Leaders Network, and then I'll hand over to Annie to talk about our next steps. But if anyone is interested in this process or youth advocacy in general, please do check out the Future Leaders Network on their website and Twitter, LinkedIn. And you can apply to be, we're the delegates for a year, so you can apply to be our next advocates by applying around November, December time, but please do sign up to their mailing list, I think, and Fiona's very helpfully put the website in the chat. This process getting to work with the delegates, not just from the Y7, but also our UK delegates from the Y20 and COP, has been an incredible experience. I've learned so much, and yeah, have been challenged in so many ways that I would really encourage anyone who is even thinking about it to reach out if they want to have a chat. We're more than happy to talk through the process in more detail, but would 100% recommend it. And I'll pass to Annie to talk about our next steps very briefly.
Yeah, thank you. I would completely agree. Please do check it out. It's been an amazing experience. And then just as a kind of next step, we are planning on handing in this petition to Downing Street next week ahead of the G7 summit, which starts on the 26th. Where they're going to be, the G7 will be discussing their priorities, and we want to really make sure that we keep the pressure on and make sure that our voices are heard and that these recommendations are heard. And so we've put together a tweet, and we would love it if you would support it online. I think Safia is going to put it in the chat right now. We've made a hashtag Youth Voices Matter, and we would love your support on that to make sure that, as Bernice said, that we get that sense of jeopardy, and we make the leaders realize that this is something that's incredibly important, and these recommendations need to be listened to. And then I can hand back to Safia.
Thank you. Bernice, did you want to come in quickly?
Sorry, I just said to Ben, I want to sign off. I need to sign off when I have an emergency. Suddenly, it's genuinely weirdly, but great to have been here. It's my honor. Thank you so much. Best of luck. Let us know how it went. Anything we can help to do as well. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bernice.
Thank you, Bernice.
Bye.
Yes, and on that note, I'd just like to say a really huge thank you as well to Chatham House, to the Common Futures Conversation Programme, and to the Future Leaders Network for supporting this launch event and supporting us on this journey. Yeah, the youth engagement process to the G7 has been such an important process so far, and it has only just begun. As Annie said, we've got so many incredible opportunities lined up over the next few months to advocate for these recommendations and go deeper into how they can be implemented internationally, but also at local levels and in the community. Yeah, a huge thank you to everyone who's attended today, who wants to learn more, who's already doing so much work in this space. Please do keep an eye out for future events and opportunities to engage with us and our Y20 and COP colleagues who are just as much part of this series and this journey. And do get in touch with us if you have any ideas for collaborations or coordinated actions. We're really happy and would love to hear from you. So thank you so much. And I'll hand over to you then for the final word.
Oh, thank you, all of you. That was really, really great, really inspiring. Yeah, it's such an exciting process, and we're really glad that we were able to sort of help to share this today, and that we will be sort of helping to sort of feed into these conversations as they continue over the summer. Thank you everybody who joined us to listen, and for your great questions and contributions. As we said, we will keep everybody kind of updated through our newsletter and through the Common Futures Conversations community on what happened at the G7 and where we actually get with the communiqué, and how we hand that over to the youth networks looking after the G20, COP27, all of these other really, really critical summits that are happening in 2022. If you want to catch up with how Chatham House is covering the G7 summit, I suppose with my comms hat on, I'd better plug that you should visit our website or follow us on Twitter at Chatham House, where you can find some really great analysis on this month of multilateralism that we're about to embark on. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and have a great evening. And thanks again, Michael, Annie, and Safia, for your contributions.